Hello, historians. I'm about to proceed on a lecture. The lecture is going to take a while. And while I'm speaking, I'm going to use a PowerPoint. I'd like you to take notes as I go throughout this. Some of the content that I'm going to share with you is going to be on the unit test when we're ready to move on. The purpose of today's lecture is to once again talk about World War I, but I want to focus on specifically what the different actors who participated in World War I wanted so that you can contrast what they actually got. And the reason for doing that is to understand World War II, you need to understand how dissatisfied everyone who came out of World War I was. So it's a long lecture, but that's the purpose. So let's begin with the very end of World War I. This is always fun to say. On the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the gentleman you see in the painting, projected on your screen right now, met in a railway car in northern France, near where Paul and his company was in All Quiet on the Western Front, and they signed a ceasefire. Now, a ceasefire, also called an armistice, is not a surrender. It's just an agreement to stop shooting each other in the face. Now, interestingly, this has become known as Armistice Day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So at 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, every year, school children from Belgium, Britain, and France have, I think, something like an 11-second or an 11-minute observance of silence in recognition of the peace that came from World War I. And specifically, the students are asked each year at that specific time to contemplate what a world without war would be. So here we go. From the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, everybody stopped shooting themselves in the face. And then for a year's time, diplomats from all over the world, and the picture that you're looking at right here gives you a sense of that. Diplomats from all over the world, and we're talking about thousands of diplomats from all of the countries and empires that you could possibly think of in 1919, descended on Paris, and they decided on two things. The first is what they were going to do with the defeated empires of World War I. And the second was they were debating on how to create a world where war would never be used as an option again. This is known as the Paris Peace Conference. It occurred in 1919, and it was a complete and utter failure. It pretended to be a democratic process where all these men that you're looking at on the screen right now were voting. But in reality, only 4 men had power. And you're looking at those 4 players right now. One is the President of the United States. The other is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The third man is Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. And then finally, you have the leader of Italy. So these 4 men represented the victors of World War I, and because they won World War I, and they had invested the most money and lost the most lives, they expected to have the greatest amount of say in what happened to the losers, and maybe more importantly, what the new world would look like. So the results of World War I, you read Strayer, so I just want to go through this quickly. Who won? Well, the big winners are Britain and France. Everyone allied with Britain and France were also victors, and that included Japan. It also included China. Italy and the United States were also among the victors. On the other hand, you have the defeated, and this is 3 empires. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And when they lost World War I, and their fates were decided during the Paris Peace Conference, one of the first things to occur was their empires were disbanded. The German Empire would exist no more. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was separated into a bunch of different countries, and the same thing occurred with the Ottoman Empire. But there's another actor in this story, that was once considered a great power of Russia, excuse me, a great power of Europe. I just gave it away. And that is Russia, or the Russian Empire, which became the Soviet Union. Now, this is an interesting story. In 1917, the second to last year of World War I, Russia lost its ability to carry on, not because they were defeated per se, but because people within the Russian Empire were tired of fighting. They realized how ridiculous the war aims were, and they went through a civil war. We know that civil war as the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Russian Empire ceased to exist. They were on the right side of the war. They would have been victors, but they didn't make it to the end. And in their place, a new communist Marxist state was born that we knew for approximately 70 years, give or take, as the USSR or the Soviet Union. So now we've set the stage with our Armistice Day in 1918 and the Paris Peace Conference and who won and who lost. I want to shift to the real focus of today's lecture, and that is what each one of these actors that you need to be aware of, what they wanted to get out of World War I. The Great War of 1914 was a foolish, greedy war. I often characterize it to you as a war of imperialism. And in that vein, the different participants in World War I each had very self-serving goals. And maybe that's a stupid comment. Maybe you could say, hey, Mr. Sanders, in every war, if you fight in it, if you win, you expect to get something out of it. But I think the greed demonstrated by the various participants was particularly rapacious. So let's go through them. We're going to start with a quote. I'll give you a second to read. So this quote was made by a man who was a master of realpolitik. His name is Otto von Bismarck, and he worked for Kaiser Wilhelm II's father, the first German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm I. And he was the brains behind the first Kaiser. And in this very interesting quote, before he died about 20 years before World War I, he amazingly, at least in my opinion, foresaw that the cause of World War I was going to be an incident, a triggering flashpoint incident in the Balkan Peninsula. So let's begin there. You're looking at the Balkan Peninsula right now. If you look at the top right, you'll see the country of Slovenia. Interestingly enough, that's where Donald Trump's wife comes from. If you go all the way to the south of the Balkan Peninsula, you'll see Greece. That's the home of Zeus. If you look to the northeast, you'll see Romania, and that, of course, is the home of Dracula. And smack dab in the middle, you'll see Serbia. And Serbia is where Gavrilo Princip, the terrorist of the Black Hand, the assassin of the Archduke, lived, and where all this trouble that became World War I started. This piece of land that you're seeing right here, it's very beautiful. I've never been there, but I know a lot of people who have visited. They say it's absolutely gorgeous. It's approximately the same size as the Korean Peninsula, and it doesn't have a lot of value in terms of resources, but it is important where it is on the map, particularly because it touches the Mediterranean Sea to the south. So World War I started with the assassination in Serbia, and then that led to a chain of events over the course of the month of July. You know it as the July Crisis, that then leads specifically to World War I. Now, the problem that was occurring in the Balkans, in case you didn't see this on one of the evidence cards, is that the Balkans at one point had belonged to the Ottoman Empire. It gained its independence, and when it gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire, all of these countries started to sprout out of the Balkan Peninsula. It was a violent process, and usually when countries are born, it is a violent process. We know this violent process, the birth of new countries, as balkanization, And it all comes back to what happened in the Balkans at the start of World War I. I'm going to be silent for just a moment. I recommend writing this definition down in your notebook, but go ahead and read to yourselves the definition of the term balkanization. Okay, let's move on. So now let's talk about the major actors. Serbia, and you did a pretty good job communicating this to me in your essay. The Balkans just wanted to protect itself from Austria, and they wanted to bring the other Slavs together in like a big Slavic country, eventually what would be known as the country of Yugoslavia. That's a story for another day. Don't worry. But Serbia was a pretty minor player in the grand scheme of World War I. Russia, on the other hand, was a major player. So let's talk about what Russia wanted going into World War I. And remember, each one of these actors going into World War I wants a very self-serving trophy from the war. And this is what Russia wanted. Russia is the largest country in the world. These dots that you see surrounding the country of Russia are its ports. And I want to show you an interesting geographic problem that Russia has before I tell you exactly what they wanted out of World War I. So we're going to focus on 4 ports. One in the Baltic Sea, one in the Arctic Sea, one just north of North Korea on the Pacific Sea, and then finally we're going to take a look at a picture of Russia's port on the Black Sea. Okay, so take a look at this picture. This is their port on the Baltic Sea in Europe. This is a Russian port in the Arctic Ocean. This is their port on the Pacific Ocean. This is north of North Korea. And finally, this is their port on the Black Sea. I'm going to show you the first 3 in rapid succession. So here we go. The Baltic port, focus on the water. Arctic, focus on the water. Pacific, focus on the water. And then this is the Black Sea. This is another view of the Black Sea. This is not a Russian port, but this is actually the Black Sea. You'll notice the ice, but again, please focus on the water. So the Black Sea was different than the first 3 ports. The first 3 ports, what I'm hoping that you saw, is that they were covered in ice. And while their port on the Black Sea that I'm pointing to with the red arrow all the way to the top, you'll see where it says Yalta above Black and Black Sea. So look at this picture again of the Black Sea in the distance. Now you can see how incredibly cold this picture of Romania is by this ice covering the cars. But if you look at the Black Sea, it's not frozen, which is different than the Pacific Ocean port, the Arctic port, and then the Baltic port, all which are frozen over. So the problem with the Black Sea port is, thankfully for the Russians, it doesn't freeze over, but unfortunately, for the Russia to take advantage of its Black Sea port on the Crimean Peninsula, you'll notice that it has to go from that first red arrow at the top to the second, to the third to get out into the Mediterranean Sea. And to get out into the Mediterranean Sea, they have to twice go through the country of Turkey. At the time, it was the Ottoman Empire. As you might imagine, Russia and the Ottoman Empire are long-standing enemies, largely because the Ottoman Empire traps Russia from being able to easily export its goods to a larger market. Peter the Great is seen as the founder of the Russian Empire. I'm going to be quiet for just a moment here and let you read a quote by him, and then I'm going to tie it all together and show you why these ports are so important to World War I. Peter the Great is the founder of the Russian Empire in the 1700s, and he's giving his people and his progeny, the people who are going to come after him, a very specific piece of advice. And the very specific piece of advice is this: for the Russian Empire to grow, to economically mature and be able to sell all of these products, they have to solve a major geographic problem that to this day plagues Russia. And that's the problem of not having warm water ports. There are 4 different directions that Russia can export its goods by sea. One is to the north, one is to the east, one is to the west, and one is to the south. The east, north, and west ports, they all freeze over for long periods of time. So the Russians can't export their goods throughout the entire year. And Russia is absolutely filthy rich in raw materials: uranium, petroleum, iron. The list is fairly extraordinary. Now, the southern port they have, while it is a warm water port because the Black Sea doesn't freeze over, the Black Sea is self-contained and surrounded by the Ottoman Empire, now today Turkey, so Russia can export its goods easily by sea. Exporting goods by sea is really the most cost-efficient way to move goods around. So what did Russia want from World War I? They wanted a warm water port. Their idea was if they can defeat certain enemies, they can take their land. And if they can take their land, then they can build warm water ports. Their ideal scenario was to take warm water ports from the Ottoman Empire or to absorb the Balkan Peninsula, because most of the people within the Balkan Peninsula were the same ethnicity, the same nation, the Slavic people, as the Russian Slavic people. So the Russians were hoping that they could expand their territory if they won World War I, so that they could get a port that opened into the Indian Ocean or into the Mediterranean Sea, so that they could easily and profitably sell all the natural resources that they had. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop my lecture there. It's a long lecture, and we'll pick it up tomorrow.